Okay, I have 1:30 on my clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center's Pest in Progress webinar series. I am Lene Jess. I'm the co-director of the North Central IPM Center. And we are one of 4 regional centers supported by the USDA NIFA Crop Protection and Pest Management Program. And we're part of the regional coordination program of that. We have a mission to coordinate IPM across the region. And we started this series so that PDs could hold their required meetings for the Crop Protection Pest Management Grants Program. Because of COVID, we decided to do it virtually. And I want to remind everybody that if you have questions, Dr. Brewer would like to take questions throughout his talk. So if you have a question that you come up with, you can either type your question in the Q&A, which for most of us is along the bottom bar towards the right side of your Zoom. Or you can use the raise hand feature, which again is on that bottom bar. We'd like to welcome Dr. Brewer today. Gary is the professor of insect pest management at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's located in Lincoln, Nebraska. His CPPM ARDP grant was titled a multi-tactic push-pull strategy for controlling stable flies on pasture cattle in Nebraska and Florida. I will be posting a link as Gary is talking to his website. So if you want to follow up later with more questions or get in contact with Gary, you can take note of that link that I put over on the side. So with that, Gary, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for doing this.
Yes, thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity to talk about our work with stable flies and cattle. And but I'll start off with the cast of characters. So these are the people involved in this project. Alex Lehman is a graduate student. Myself and Dave Boxler are the co-PIs for the project. We're both with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dave is located in the central part of the state, not in Lincoln itself, at one of our research extension centers, and that's where the field work for this project, or the majority of the field work for this project, has been done. Jerry Zhu is an ARS faculty member at Lincoln, Nebraska. Our other Jerry Hogsett, is another ARS scientist, and he is in Gainesville, Florida. Kathy Hanford is a statistician at Lincoln, and Matt Stockton is a ag economist in Lincoln as well. Georgina Bingham, she was our university partner, but we've been fortunate enough now that she's joined us here in the entomology department at University of Nebraska. So that's the cast of characters, if I can put it that way. But the real star of this project are the stable fly and our cattle that we produce in Nebraska, and similarly in many other places around the country as well, very much similar to our production systems. I've got 2 flies up on the screen just to give you kind of a perspective of 2 flies you can find associated with cattle, and everybody's familiar with the house fly. And that's there more for a size perspective. The stable fly is a little bit smaller than the house fly, and there's some color patterning differences. And but as you're swatting at flies, you may not notice that so easily. The most diagnostic trait to separate house flies from stable flies is right here at the tip of the head of the stable fly. You can see this long proboscis out here. That's the biting mouth parts of the stable fly. And they're the ones that help it successfully blood feed. Houseflies do not bite. They have sponging, lapping types of mouth parts. So stable flies are blood feeders, and both females and males will feed on take blood meals. In their life cycle as adult flies, most of the time they are not on the cattle. They will visit or go to cattle 2 to 3 times a day to take a blood meal. But other than that, they're away from the cattle, resting, digesting their most recent blood meal, or perhaps searching out for an oviposition site. Stable flies are one of our major pests of cattle in the U.S. They are not native here, but they have actually been distributed almost everywhere in the world now. But in the US, their economic impact is estimated to be about 2.2 billion per year. And about half of that loss, that economic injury that results from stable fly interacting with cattle, is associated with cattle in pastures. Sometimes if you're observing cattle and you see them doing this sort of thing, and that you see in these two pictures, it's a pretty good diagnostic of these animals. These are being infested or bothered significantly by stable flies, and so they engage in some defensive behaviors to lessen the biting incidents that they are experiencing. And one of these behaviors is just to clump up in a big group, and the strongest cattle will move to the center and push the other ones out to the periphery. And the stable flies, as they come to this group of cattle, this herd, they'll bite the ones on the outside, and the ones on the interior will be somewhat protected from being bitten. So that, from the cow's point of view or the cattle point of view, maybe that's okay. But while they're inside, they are probably overheating from being bunched up amongst all their fellow cattle. So that causes them heat stress. And of course, when they're doing this, they're not feeding, which is what the ranchers want them to do. They want them to feed and put on weight. Another version of this is if there's a stock pond around, the cattle will wade into that. And that protects them somewhat from the biting as well, because the stable flies like to bite on the lower legs of the cattle. And so if they can get into the water, they can somewhat protect themselves from biting from that regard as well. But once again, they're not feeding, so they're not gaining the weight the producers would like to see. Another attribute of stable flies is that they have a very wide host range. And the name stable references horses. So it's horse stables. And as I mentioned earlier, stable flies are not native to North America. They were brought in with livestock from Europe, and were initially associated with urban centers on the East Coast, where horses were one of the major transportations in cities at that time. So the stables and urban centers on the East Coast were where this common name came from, stable flies. Stable flies don't mind biting people. So there's a picture of a stable fly feeding on someone in the lower left of the screen. There's a tiger on the top at the Smithsonian Zoo. It looks like probably a somewhat rare white tiger, but tigers have stable fly problems. And this poor bird on the bottom, this pelican chick, is just overwhelmed with a huge number of stable flies around its eye. And so this picture was probably taken from a wildlife refuge in North Dakota or Montana, where there's a lot of pelican breeding happening. But this is kind of wetlands, and it produces lots of stable flies. And this poor chick here is probably about ready to die from its infestation. But so we're interested in cattle. So there's a picture of a cow's leg on the upper right, and you can see stable flies on that leg. And the economic injury level for stable flies on pasture cattle is about the upper range. That would be about 7 per leg. So you can see this animal certainly has more than that. Another feature of stable fly biology, which helps them to be successful, is that they can oviposit and successfully develop in lots of different media. The commonality is there's a decay in organic matter, primarily plant matter, that they will breed in, and so cattle are a good source of that. So you get cattle together, you feed them some fodder, there's spillage, and it gets mixed in maybe with cattle manure, or almost certainly with cattle manure and urine. And that produces a really excellent resource for developing stable flies. But they're not exclusive to that sort of habitat. Compost piles, and so maybe if you have a compost pile in your yard, you're trying to do a good thing. but you may be contributing to the stable fly population. Seaweed washed up on the beaches can be a resource for stable flies. So stable flies can be, or in some cases are considered economic pests for the tourism industry in Florida, because tourists want to be on the beach, they want to be enjoying the ocean, and they can get driven away by biting stable flies. In pastures, development sites for stable flies are really hard to find. They're widely dispersed, small resources, and so larval control is not too easily done in pasture situations. There is one exception that some of the ranchers in the Midwest, the Great Plains states will use to feed their cattle during the wintertime. They will have these round hay balers where they will concentrate some hay to supplement their winter grazing. And as the cattle feed on that, there's a lot of spillage, as you can see around this baler here. This isn't a winter shot, but as the cattle feed on it, they're spilling this hay, they're trampling it into the ground, there's manure and urine mixed in. So next spring and early summer, this can be a location for concentrated production of stable flies coming out of this rich resource that results from this overwintering feeding system. However, by early summer, that resource is becoming depleted or is drying out, and it's probably not a real good breeding site anymore. So we still have stable flies after that point, but we can't really locate where they're coming from. So how do we actually generally manage stable flies? What's the typical practice? Well, it's a reliance on insecticides. And insecticides have a short lifespan on animals. So probably, certainly in our location here in Nebraska, we would need frequent reapplication, probably weekly. And as a consequence of that, and also the fact that there's not a whole lot of registered insecticides that can be used, we're concerned about resistance development, resistance to insecticides developing. There's a number of ways to apply insecticides to cattle. Sprays, of course. There's rub and oiler systems where the cattle will brush up against these devices and insecticide will move onto their body. There's others, formulations such as pour-ons, where you actually pour a stream of this onto the back of the animal. And those pour-ons can be effective for several weeks. Another common way ranchers in the Midwest will use to protect cattle from flies is ear tags. But the target of ear tags is horn flies. That's another major pest species. And ear tags are ineffective in managing stable flies because the ear tag is a slow release device, and it slowly dispenses onto the neck and shoulders of the cattle and doesn't get down onto the legs where the stable flies are feeding. So they are not really affected. This picture shows a pasture in north central Nebraska, and we're out there and using a mist blower to drift an insecticide across the cattle. And so this has been effective, and a number of, there are producers using this device to manage their stable flies, not just in Nebraska, but elsewhere as well. And so it is effective, and you can load it in the back of the pickup, as you can see. And so as the ranchers are going out to check on their cattle at least weekly, they can integrate this spray application into that typical management practice. So it fits well that way. However, the equipment is expensive. It's not precisely aimed. So you're using something like this. There is drift. And as I already mentioned, we're concerned about developing insecticide resistance. There are reports of resistance to all the classes of insecticides we use to manage stable flies. If you're real innovative, you might try this. So this was in the press, popular press a couple of years ago, probably already, and it's based upon the observation and the reports and studies in Africa on tsetse flies, which don't seem to bother zebras very much. And since then we know that it's that the zebra patterning may have part of that, maybe part of that why tsetse flies are not so interested in zebras, but there's also some odors and repellents associated with zebra urine and so forth that are also involved. But but some people have looked at this. They go out, hi, let's paint our cows or cattle so they look like zebras, and maybe we can reduce stable fly infestation. And it may have a little bit of help, but I don't think you're going to get too many ranchers to do this. Another approach to managing stable flies is use of traps. And over the years, there's been a lot of variation in traps. Quite a few of them are just simple white panels, such as shown in the upper left corner. And so it's just a white panel. It's plastic. These are plastic panels, so they're weather resistant, and they're coated with a sticky trap or a stickum. So as stable flies come to it to rest, they are captured. In the middle picture is Jerry Hogsett, one of the collaborators on the project. He's one of our USDA partner in Florida. And he is displaying an alcinite trap. So this is another visual trap, and it's a particular type of plastic that has a reflective pattern that stable flies seem to be attracted to. So it's been used for a lot of monitoring systems to look for stable flies. But Jerry's here at the Smithsonian Museum in this picture. And so it looks like in the background, I think that's a cheetah. And he's out there trying to help the zoo manage their localized stable fly problem. So with all the animals there, they're probably doing a good job of growing stable flies. And so Jerry's trying to set up some traps to help manage some of the stable fly problem in the Smithsonian Zoo. And to the right, you see here's another picture from the Smithsonian. This is a tiger, and now he's using a different type of trap. This is what you see there is a round cylinder with some stripes on it, and it looks like a chess piece sticking out of the top. So this is a nightstick trap, commercially available, and it's turned out to be a fairly effective stable fly trap. It's a visual trap again. Other types of traps have been borrowed from what we have learned from tsetse fly management. So a lot of these are variations of a blue-black design. And in the upper right, you can see some of those. So these are attracted to the flies, the tsetse flies, and they'll move towards the trap and then get fly upward and get collected in some part of the passive design of the trap. So the flies move in, they can't get out again. And on the left, you can see a version of that being looked at in Nebraska. And so we got that same blue and black kind of design to it. But the difference here is that these are insecticide treated cloth. And as the flies come and rest on this cloth, stable flies, so stable flies have very similar biology and attraction. As they come and rest on this cloth, they are lethally intoxicated. And what's kind of nice about this is that treated cloth will remain effective for at least 3 months. So it gives us season-long stable fly control. And here on the bottom left is another version of just a simple white sticky trap. This one's even more simple. It's a plastic bag with a piece of white paper inside and stick them on the outside. So all of these are versions of traps that have been used for stable fly control and monitoring. And they're based upon the visual attraction to the stable flies. So what have we've been doing in our study using in our push-pull study? And I'll explain push-pull in a little bit. But so there's our white tiger again in the nightstick trap. It's a registered product sold through Bug Jammer Incorporated. So you can go onto their webpage and find them. And so we put together a version of their trap. We're using their sticky wrap as it seems to be very effective. But we've added an odorant lure to their trap. So our trap now has, as you can see on the right, there's we have just a simple setup so we can hang a cachet with a odor lure in it and help to improve the trap capture by combining both this visual attraction and the odor lure as well. And you can see on this trap, there's quite a few stable flies on it. So let's talk a little bit with that introduction, talk a little bit about what is push-pull. I mean, it's not necessarily a real new technique for IPM, but it's fairly new for animal production systems, but it's been used for quite a while in cropping systems. And the basic ideas behind push-pull is to take advantage of an insect's behavior. So the goal is to intercept and interfere with the normal insect behavior. And what you're trying to do by doing this is to direct pest insects away from the commodity, whether it's a crop plant or, in our case, some cattle, and you want to move them to another location where they're not going to cause you harm and or you may be able to reduce their populations. So for stable flies, what we were looking at is the behaviors we were trying to influence are host seeking, and with our odor lure, also capture flies that are seeking an oppositional site. And hopefully we had some outcomes that came out of this, or we were looking to try to make some improvement in, and animal welfare. You saw how the cattle behave when they are bothered by stable flies. So we wanted to improve animal welfare and animal comfort by reducing fly loads on the cattle. And as a consequence, then we should have some improved cattle production economics resulting. And the other goal that we were looking to get towards is reducing our use of conventional insecticides, reducing toxicants that were in the ecosystem. So what was some of the more specifics about what we did? So part of our push-pull treatment was a repellent termed Cocoa FFA because it was derived from coconut, and FFA is free fatty acids. So this was developed by the Jerry Zoo Lab in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it's a mixture of some fairly benign compounds. So C8, C10, and C12 carbon fatty acids. So fatty acids are normal materials produced by humans and mammals, or essentially all animals and plants. And so it has low environmental impact. And then on the pull side, we had our traps that were both visually attractive and odorant attractive to stable flies. So that was the pull component of our push-pull treatment. So to put these pieces together, here's a graphical model of our treatment design. So we had the 3 treatments, which were push-pull, had a positive check, a negative check. The push-pull had those 2 pieces. It was the coconut fatty acid repellent and the stable fly trap. And on the far right of this graphic, you can see what we were hoping to have happen in terms of how we affect stable flies in the push-pull. We pushed the stable flies from the cattle and pulled into the traps. That was our objective, to see if we could get that done. Permethrin is in there as a positive check. And so in this case, our outcome on stable flies was we were trying to kill them. We lethally provide them, or make sure they got a lethal intoxication. And so then we wanted to compare that results from the positive check, the permethrin treatment, with our push-pull. And of course, then we also had a negative check for essentially untreated cattle. And the effect on flies should have been nothing. They would have normal movement to and from the cattle. So, so showing you some of the pictures of our traps, and both a little bit away and a more of a close up, so you can see in the close up version of the trap, you can see the lure hanging inside. And you also notice that there's a fence around this. This is because cattle can be curious, and or when they're a bunch of them, they can just bump into things and bust them and knock them down. So we had to fence them to keep them from being damaged by the cattle. And we would bring the animals back into a sorting area and run them through the chute where they could be treated either with the pesticide permethrin or the push-pull repellent would be sprayed on them. So what happened? So we started in 2018, and we immediately had some bit of a trouble that year because we were coming out of a drought year, and some of our pastures were in bad condition, so we couldn't use them all. And so we had to reduce what we did, and we ended up just looking at the push-pull and the permethrin treatments. We forego that season having the negative untreated check. But interestingly, I mean, or encouragingly, what we saw, this is shows what happened over the 6-week study period that summer, is that both the push-pull and the permethrin treatments pretty much affected stable flies the same way. So as you can see, there's variation from week to week in stable fly numbers in response to the general environment, whether it's favorable or less favorable for adult fly production. But the two products, the two treatments, affected stable flies pretty much the same thing. So we were encouraged with that, and then hopeful that in 2019 and then last summer we would be able to look at this with the full set of 3 treatments. And
Gary,
actually,
we have a question real quick. Somebody wants
Sure.
to know, how often do you change the sticky traps?
Well, that they would be changed out once a week as well.
Okay, thank you.
You know, in some locations, it may not be necessary to change them as quickly. Nebraska is a windy state, and cattle can create some dust by their moving around. So not only just because, you know, the traps maybe still had sticky on them, but if it gets too dusty, it doesn't work. So we would swap them out once a week. Same time we did the spray treatments. Okay, so originally we had hoped to, analyze our data across all the years, but when we got into 2019 and then in 2020, there were some significant differences in the years, and primarily you can see that in terms of the magnitude of the fly populations. And so you can take a look at the y-axis for 2019. You see numbers reached up into the 45 stable flies per cattle per animal, and whereas in 2020 the highest number on the control cattle was around 10. So there was significantly fewer stable flies in 2020, again because it was a drier, probably mostly because it was a drier year. And so we ended up needing to analyze the data separately by each year, but we presenting them different aspects of our analyses side by side so we can take a look at what happened in the 2 years at the same time. The most interesting thing, most encouraging thing is that in both years, the push-pull treatment and the permethrin treatment were over the whole weeks of our whole period of our study season. The results for those 2 treatments, the 2 active treatments, the push-pull and the permethrin, were significantly less than on the control. So we were very effective in reducing the on-animal fly loads by using this repellent in a push-pull study and got results almost mirroring what happened with the standard permethrin treatment in 2019 and again in 2020. So we saw the same thing, even though the 2 years had significantly different overall fly load populations, fly density populations. So this is real encouraging in that we see that we can use this biopesticide, this fatty acid-based repellent, and reduce fly load populations on cattle, similarly to what we saw by using the standard insecticide. And so every week of both of these years, even though the looks like maybe there's some overlap in week 5 in 2019, that we did have significant difference from the 2 treatments from the control, and there was no significant difference between the 2 controls or 2 treatments, sorry. And a little bit different in 2020 in that we saw some separation between the permethrin and the push-pull treatment for week 1, but afterwards they started looking the same as well. So again, it was encouraging from what we saw in terms of the fact of how well the treatments work compared to the standard insecticide treatment, and the fact that we saw pretty much the same thing both over these 2 years. Down below it just gives you, here's an average, what this least square means of stable flies per animal on the control animals through the season in 2019 versus, so a high of 38, almost 39 versus about 8 in 2020. So quite a bit of difference. We also want to take a look at what happened within the week. So if just to refresh back to you, we'd retreat every week. So that means we'd spray the animals again with either the permethrin or the repellent, and we'd reset the traps. And we wanted to look at what happened during that week. One of the concerns with using the repellent is that they're short-lived. That just because of the fact that they are repellents, they have to volatilize so they can affect the insects' chemoreception of those chemicals and keep them from moving to and actually actively move them away from the cattle. So by design, they're supposed to decay and volatilize away. And so we were concerned if we used a repellent, maybe we wouldn't see very long treatment effects. But again, let's take a look at 2020 on the left, where we see on top, here's the dashed line for the controls. And during the week, both we saw, from day 1 through 4 days after treatment, the 2 treatments, very, very much the same results we saw. So both we knew the repellent's going to disappear, but we also see that the permethrin treatment also decays. It's pretty much the same rate, and at least in 2019, in terms of how long these materials remain effective. But this also tells us, that pretty soon, if we went out more days, we would probably see the numbers on the treated cattle and those on the control cattle converging, and that's why we would have to, or ranchers will need to be able to retreat their animals relatively frequently. And kind of the same thing we saw in 2020, that after a few days, we start to see the loss of efficacy of both the permethrin and the push-pull treatments. Here is the plot just showing everything that happened in all our sampling dates in that year. So 1/1 would be week 1, 1 day after treatment. 1/2 would be week 1, 2 days after treatment. So you can see through that summer that the 2 treatments of push-pull and the insecticide treatment, they they'd bounce around as the general population bounced around, but they would be less than what we saw on the control animals. So they provided us protection all season long, with a few exceptions down in later in the season as conditions started to change somewhat. And but it's also interesting to me, at least, that how as control animal fly loads on control animals go up, treatment populations also go up, but they remain below that of the treated animals. 2020, same sort of graph. This one's a lot more messy. Don't necessarily know why. It may have something to do with the fact that overall the fly populations were very low, and so a lot more. So maybe just more inherent variation into that circumstance. So what about the traps? And what were they doing? So you can see a trap again. This one's a bit larger than the earlier pictures. You can see stable flies were on the trap. And over the 2 seasons of 2019 and 2020, we saw that stable fly traps, our trap captures, were fairly high. And 2019, when we had higher stable fly populations overall, almost got 13,000, close to 13,700. So we caught a fair amount of stable flies and less in 2020. But what we are still trying to work through and figure out is what contribution those captures had to the overall management of stable flies in the push-pull system. I did some quick just relationship checking. So it made some took a ratio of trap capture to on-animal numbers, and we saw that in 2019, that ratio was 3.1 and 2.9 in 2020. So those ratios are very similar, but as I say, I'm not sure what that tells us as yet, but it's interesting, and maybe, it's worth delving into that a little bit more. So for traps, or these two numbers would be the sums from, we'd have 8 stable fly traps in the pastures with the push-pull treatment. And in all our treatment pastures, there'd be 5 cattle in that herd. So this is the numbers that we pulled off from the sums of 8 traps and 5 cattle. So where does this bring us? How can I summarize this? Well, across each study season, the permethrin and push-pull treatments were very similar in their effects, and they were alike in that they reduced fly numbers compared to those numbers on the check animals. So the results mirrored an earlier, as I said, multi-year proof of concept trial. Well, no, I guess I didn't talk about this one yet. We did, before we actually started this study, we did a version of this, kind of a proof of concept to ourselves of a push-pull study. And in that case, we didn't use the coconut repellent. We used a plant-based essential oil, geraniol. That was the repellent. This is registered for use on cattle as well. And so we used that repellent as the push treatment. And in that case, we used another set of cattle as the pull tactic. So one group of cows were left to be attractive to the stable flies, so they didn't receive the repellent, and we used those as our push and pull. And in that study, we saw results very similar to what I showed you about this particular study, where we used traps as the pull versus another group of cattle, which isn't a good idea, because if you got to protect your animals from stable flies, you want to protect them all. We still, as I mentioned, are trying to work through and understand what's the overall contribution of the traps to the results in the push-pull system. and what's the best design for the trap. So there's still evolution that we need to go through there. And the best use of, how many traps you want to need is 8. Is our number 8 good or not? Should we have more? And so a lot of that, how to actually use traps, still needs more work. This will be the first report of a repellent being used on animals in this fashion in cattle as effective, and showing it being as effective as standard insecticide in reducing on-animal fly load. So we're pretty excited about that. However, we also noted that by the end of the week, both the insecticide and push-pull treatments had lost efficacy. Now, it didn't surprise us, but it's an important part of our understanding of this, that periodic retreatments are needed. And so that brings me to kind of thinking about this as how to make this sort of a process more effective, more attractive to ranchers that are actually growing our cattle. And so most of them, at least in our location where we have large pastures, animals are out in those pastures, and the ranchers do not want to bring them back in and run them through a chute to treat them on a weekly basis. It's just not part of their overall cattle management scheme. And it would actually be detrimental, because every time you round them up, these are semi-wild animals almost, because they don't see people too often. And you round them up, that stresses them. So you want to avoid that. And one way we might be able to do that is by emplacing some automated sprayer technology. Shown here in this picture is one from this company, 3D QuickHand. And we're going to be testing some of these this summer to see if we can coax our cattle to go through them. Sometimes they need to be acclimated to these devices. They're kind of suspicious of anything unusual. So we need to acclimate them through that. But once we achieve that, will they move through? And then will this sprayer help us to deliver the insecticide in a way that can fit in with the standard ranch management practice? Another approach that we've toyed with in the past, and maybe, or we're going to see if we can, we haven't gone away from it yet. As I mentioned earlier, ear tags provide insecticide control for horn flies as they're hung on as the ears of the cattle, and as they brush across their shoulders and neck, they deliver a slow release insecticide and provide them protection from stable flies. So could we do an equivalent of that on cattle legs? So a couple of years ago, we made some homemade cow bracelets, and you can see one on the picture here. And so that was strapped onto the leg of the cattle, and there's a little pocket there, and we have a impregnated strip of cloth in there with repellent on it, or you could put an insecticide on it, and with the goal of trying to manage stable flies in this fashion, kind of similar to an ear tag for the upper part of the body. If you look here, you can see the leg with the bracelet doesn't have any flies on it, but this other leg does have some flies. So maybe it'd work a little bit, but there's still engineering things to do if we're going to move in this direction. So how do you put them on? You have to make sure you have installer safety. If you're working around a cow's leg, you're in a hazardous location. Sudden kick or movement by the cow could cause somebody some real harm. And we'd like to put this on as a long-lasting, slow-release formulation so that it persists through the fly season. You put something like this on an animal's leg, it has to be non-irritating. So you don't want ulcers or some sort of sore happening underneath that. And then ideally, it would be great if this thing just degraded and dropped off at the end of the fly season, so you don't have to manually take it off. So that's still in our radar as something to try to work toward. And it might be another alternative for some ranchers. We also recognize that there's lots of room for still a better stable fly trap. And, we like this design that Nightstick came out with using this plastic tube. It's really just a piece of plumbing plastic drain tube. And it works well for us in our location because we can stabilize it into the ground so it's not wiggling around when the wind's blowing. And it's pretty easy to access and reset when we need to. And as a reminder, again, this is a visual trap, but also we incorporated an odorant lure, which is a lure associated with stable fly position sites. We'd like to either replace that or combine it with a second lure that is attractive to stable flies host seeking. So maybe we can improve the traps by looking at different lures or combinations of lures.
Gary, we had another question that on the traps. It said, do the traps attract any beneficial insects like dung beetles or predatory wasps?
Haven't seen dung beetles on them. There's a number of flying insects that will bump into it or will be there. So that's with a sticky trap. If a trap like this, you always pick up some incidental insects too. Okay, so this brings me to my final slide, and on behalf of happy cattle all over the place, everywhere, I need to give some thanks to some people that helped us out. T.L. Meyer, she is a technician at the North Platte Research and Extension Station in Nebraska. So she helped us out with some cattle management, and a number of students are listed here. There's as summer interns, and of course our funding through USDA NEFA. So.
All right, thank you very much, Gary. I have one quick question.
Mm-hmm.
And I may have missed it at the beginning, but is there like a threshold for the number of flies that these cattle can tolerate, or is just one fly too many?
No, we do have an economic injury level, and I just probably rushed by it. It mentioned that seven flies per leg, and so I mean that's the threshold. These thresholds certainly need more work as well, because they were developed a long time ago, 30 years ago maybe, or somewhere in that range. So they need to be reviewed, but that's the working threshold we use at this point.
Okay, great. All right, well, I don't have any other questions in our question box, so we really appreciate your time today, Gary, for doing this for us.
No, I appreciate being able to talk about it as well.
It was a great talk. Thank you. I just
You're
want to
welcome.
let everybody know that in about a week, we have been posting the webinars up on the YouTube channel from the North Central IPM Center. So you can look for those there.
Okay.
And then we have our next webinar. We will not be holding a webinar in June, but our next one will be Wednesday, July 21st at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 Central. And that will be on using research-based solutions for integrated management of white mold in soybeans. That will be given by Damon Smith from the University of Wisconsin. So again, if anybody has any questions on upcoming webinars, you can go to our website at ncipmc.org. I'll check one more time. Oh, another question just came in. Could coconut repellent be used for rubs?
Certainly, yeah. For example, these repellents, horse owners are interested, and so applications to horses, you do not want to have a sprayer. For some reason, the noise of a sprayer spooks a lot of horses, so it's not a good idea to try to. And so some owners will just do a rub-on. Have a cloth, impregnated cloth, or a glove, actually, the rubber inside and a cloth outside, and they use that to rub it on their animals. So yes, you could do that.
Okay, great.
If your animal lets you.
Yeah.
It depends on what type of animal we're talking about.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. And again, I want to thank Gary for presenting, and we hope to see you all in July. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.